Slope and rate of change. Slope is a ratio, and a ratio is a fraction of rise over run. How much a graph goes up with how much a graph goes over left and right. Now there's a formula for finding slope. It's y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. Now those numbers are not exponents but labels. And the reason they're labels is because there's two x's and two y's in the formula. Because when you're finding slope given 2 points, you have first an x1 and a y1, and secondly an x2 and a y2, because you have two separate points, but both of them have x and y in them. Now, so what we're going to do first is we're going to write down our formula, because this is one that you're going to need to memorize. And we're going to plug in the numbers. So first up is y2, which is 5. y1 is 2. x2 is another 5. And x1 is a negative 3. Now we will subtract. 5 minus 2 is 3. Now when we subtract a negative, those two minus signs become plus, and we'll get 5 plus 3, which is 8. And that is our slope. It rises 3 and runs 8. Now if you'd like to do this one, you should pause. So the first number is x1, y1, x2, y2. And it actually doesn't make a difference which number you put in first. I could have just as easily typed 3, 2 as the first point in this problem. So I'm going to put a 2 on top because that's y2. I'm going to put minus negative 5. On the bottom, x2 is 3, and x1 is negative 6. You notice we've got a lot of negatives this time. That will turn into positives. 2 plus 5 makes 7, and 3 plus 6 makes 9. And that's our slope. Notice these two were all positive. Next, we're going to look at some slopes that are negative. So as before, I'm going to write down my formula. I'm going to identify my x1, y1, x2, y2. And then I'm going to go ahead and draw a fraction bar and put 2 minuses in there, because minus is part of the formula. Now my y2 is negative 8. My y1 is negative 4. x2 is negative 2. And my y1 is negative 3. Quite a few negatives here. But the minus and the negative from the 4 become positive. So I end up with negative 8 plus 4, which is negative 4. And on the bottom, the minus and the negative from the 3 become positive. And negative 2 plus 3 is 1. Now this is an acceptable answer, or you could simply just put a whole number or an integer, negative 4. If you'd like to try the other one, you should pause now while I write down the formula and identify my x1s and y1s. So y2 is 10, x1 is 8, or sorry, y1 is 8, x2 is negative 2, and x1 is 3. And we'll subtract. 10 minus 8 is 2. And negative 2 minus 3 is negative 5. Now, a lot of people would accept this answer, but you must be aware that this answer would not be the choice on a multiple choice standardized test. Instead, the negative should move to the top. So a better answer would be negative 2 over 5. A simplified version of fractions usually has negatives on the top. Next. So now we're going to do some ones that have zero slope. So I'm going to write down my formula. And after doing this 8 times, it should be memorized. Let me identify x1, y1, x2, y2. And now let me begin putting the numbers in place. So y2 is 4. Y1 is also 4. X2 is a third 4. And x1 is a negative 3. And when I subtract 4 minus 4, I get 0. Now that's really where I could stop. But for the notes, we'll continue on and get 7 on the bottom. But it doesn't matter what is on the denominator. If 0 is on top, then the final answer is 0. And that is the only thing you should write. Now if you'd like to try the next one, go ahead and do that now while I set up the problem. So y2 is negative 5. Y1 is also negative 5. X2 is 7. And x1 is 3. The minus and the negative from the second 5 become positive. So negative 5 plus 5 is 0. And 7 minus 3 is 4. However, this is not an acceptable answer. Instead, 0 divided by 4 is 0, and that's what you should put. Now let's see what happens if we get a 0 on the denominator. So I'm going to write my formula down. Identify my x1, y1, x2, y2. And let's start plugging in the numbers. 3 for y2, negative 4 for y1, negative 2 for x2, and negative 2 for x1. 2 negatives again make a positive 4. So that's going to be 3 plus 4 is 7. 2 negatives here become positive, and negative 2 plus 2 is 0. Now, if you take your graphing calculator and divide, you'll notice that 7 divided by 0 is not the same as 0 divided by 7. You see, in the previous problem, 0 divided by 7 results in a 0. However, when you do the reciprocal, which is what the answer to this problem is, you get an error. That's because you're not allowed to divide by 0. Since you cannot divide by 0 in math, the type of slope that we have, we cannot determine, so it is undefined. There's no numerical value for 7 divided by 0, so the slope is undefined. Now you should try the last one here and see if you can also get a 0 on the denominator. I'll set it up now. So y2 will be 7, y1 is negative 4, 1 is x2, and 1 is x1. So 7, take away negative 4, those become pluses. We get 11, and 1 minus 1 is 0. Whenever you have 0 on the bottom, you do not write the answer 0, you write undefined. Now those are the 4 types of slopes that we can get. Now in the next slide, we're going to look at what those look like visually on a graph. So we have 4 different types of slope. So I'd like you to take a moment, if you would like to, and see if you can figure out which direction lines go that are positive, negative, 0, or undefined. Keep in mind we have 4 types of lines. We have lines that are horizontal, vertical, ones that go diagonally this way, and ones that go diagonally that way. Now, one of those is the correct answer to each. So let's see if you drew the correct lines. A positive slope line goes up from left to right. A negative slope goes down from left to right. A zero slope is a horizontal line. And an undefined slope is a vertical line. Those are what the four types of slopes look like on a graph. So whenever you see a line going up, you should know that the slope will be positive. Whenever you see a line going down, you should know the slope is negative. Horizontal is always zero slope because it doesn't go up or down. However, a vertical line is straight up and down is undefined. Now, if you look here, I'm going to show you how to count the squares and do rise over run to find the slope of a line. So if you look at the first one, there's a point at -2, 0. There's another point on the graph at 1, 5. Those are the places where the graph hits a point perfectly and has integer values. No decimals like in the other places where the line hits. So what you do is you count how many places up and over it takes to get from one point to the next. So if I start at -2, 0 and I go up, how many numbers do I go up? Well, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'm going to go up 5 places. Now when I go right, I'm going to go over 1, 2, 3 places. So my slope, which is rise over run, will be a rise of 5 squares and a run of 3 squares. So if you just count how many spaces you go up on the coordinate grid, that will also determine the slope. Now, if you look at the next problem, you'll notice the equation is going down. So the result in this one should be a negative answer. Let's take a look. We have a point up here at -3, 4, and a second point at 2, -3. Now, if we start on the left, we're going to have to go down this time. So we need to count how many places we go down. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Since I went down 7 places, that's -7. The rise is -7. Now let's count how many places we run. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I ran 5 places over. So my slope will be -7 over 5. Now, if you prefer to use the formula, you can determine the points from the graph and use the formula. But when looking at a graph, I think it takes less time to count the number of squares that you need to go up or down and then over to get the point. Lastly, we're going to use the formula for finding slope to find some missing values. So we're going to use our formula. Determine our x1, y1s, x2, y2. And in this case, y2 is going to be the variable that we're solving for. So y2 is r, y1 is 4, x2 is -5, x1 is 1. Now I will simplify the part of this problem that I can. R minus 4 does not have like terms, but the denominator, -5 minus 1 does, which is -6. So I've simplified my slope formula. Now remember, this is equal to slope. And in this problem, The slope is 1 over 3. Now what we have is a proportion that can be solved via cross multiply. So I'm going to take my r minus 4 and times it by my 3. So r times 3 is 3r. Negative 4 times 3 is negative 12. I'll then come the other way and do negative 6 times 1, which is negative 6. I can solve this problem for the missing value r. I have a negative 12, so I will add 12 to both sides. So 3r equals 6. Lastly, I will divide by the coefficient. So 6 divided by 3 is 2, and that is the missing number. Now, if you'd like to set the last one up yourself and try it first, you can do that now. I'm going to start writing the equations down. So x2 is negative 1, y1 is negative 2, x2 is negative 7, and x1 is r. On the top of this, I can simplify that. 2 negatives make a positive, so negative 1 plus 2 is positive 1 over negative 7 minus r. And that equals my slope, which is negative 1/4. So let's cross multiply. 1 times 4 is 4. Negative 7 times negative 1 makes positive 7. And negative r times negative 1 makes positive r. Again, that's the multiplication property of negative 1. If you multiply a number by negative 1, you don't change the number, you just change the sign. And then we only need one step to solve this. Subtract 7 from both sides, and we get r is equal to negative 3. And that's our missing value. All right, so this was slope and rate of change.